Everybody ready? Thanks for waiting.
All right, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to AP's masterclass on artificial intelligence in journalism. There has been a lot of interesting discussions during the conference about the topic, about the technology specifically. So what we want to do today is to guide you through different examples and specific applications of AI in journalism. And then we'll guide you through a case study of how AP has implemented some of these systems within our newsroom. So the goal of this masterclass is to be very practical, and then we'll open up for questions at the end, so we can have an open discussion then. So my name is Francesco Marconi. I'm the strategy manager at the AP and the automation co-lead. In my role is to essentially assess trends, technology trends and industry opportunities, and work alongside with my colleague Lisa to implement some of those things within the newsroom.
I'm the global business editor, which means I run AP's business news coverage, but in addition, I'm the newsroom representative to AP's automation strategy committee. So as Francesco said, we work alongside our colleagues in technology and products and other parts of AP to test and develop artificial intelligence projects for AP.
Yeah, so it's a very collaborative effort. We've established an automation and artificial intelligence committee that brings together different parts of the organization.
Who wrote this story? Thousands of stories just like this appear every quarter coming out of AP, and they're actually produced by a robot. Automating corporate earnings stories was the first significant project that AP did involving automation. We collect data on earnings that are sent to templates that were written with our partner Automated Insights, and the result is what you see on the screen. And we'll talk more about that later. That will be our case study.
Yeah. So for today, we want to run by 5 key issues. So we'll start with an overview of the applications of artificial intelligence in journalism. We'll talk about all the different use cases and tools that you can deploy in your newsrooms and in your operations. Then we'll go into some key considerations on how to deploy automation or artificial strategy within your news organization. And then Lisa will share with you some key editorial takeaways and concerns, and conclude with a case study of automation specifically. As I mentioned, we'll end the discussion with an open Q&A, so you can ask your questions and share your insights as well.
I think one of the, as Francesco was saying, it's fun and exciting to talk about the technology and what it can do, but when it comes to actually implementing that in your newsroom, there are a lot of things to consider. It's not easy and it's not free, and some of the most common questions I get are, well, how did you do it? You know, how did your staff react? What did you actually have to do differently? And so these are some of the things that we'll walk through to help you understand if you're thinking of implementing these kinds of technologies in your newsroom, these are the kinds of things you need to think about. And that's really the goal, ultimately, of the session.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the key projects that we started with was turning data into stories. That was the first example that Lisa alluded to. This uses a technology called natural language generation, and we'll go into detail later on our case study. But it's essentially what you need to know here is that you can turn structured data, so any information about, let's say, sports, finance, into written stories. The way we do this is that our journalists develop templates that are written by humans, and then using AI, we automatically fill those templates with real-time data.
And at AP, we're doing this now not only with earnings stories, but with lots of sports stories as well.
And so this is the sort of when we talk about the concept of automation, that's usually what people think about, turning data into stories. But there's much more. And so here we identify 5 key components or subdomains that we consider to be relevant to journalism. And we'll go through very quick examples for each one of you so you can have a better sense of what these things entail. So the first one will be machine learning. Then we'll go into natural language, speech, vision, and robotics. These are the 5 key subdomains that we, again, consider important for journalism. And we'll start with machine learning. I won't go into any technical details, but essentially machine learning is the ability for an algorithm to break down very complex tasks into more digestible, more easy to execute tasks. And this is a very specific example of a story we developed using machine learning. We partnered with MIT Media Lab to analyze a huge corpus of data from Twitter for the first 100 days of President Trump's in office. So we wanted to find a different angle for a story that was data-driven, and this was only possible using machine learning. And so specifically what you're seeing is how the Twitter conversation is evolving over time, and how people are responding to different tweets by the president. Something interesting that we found is that the overall engagement of the president's tweets are fading, at least for the first 100 days. But there were also some pretty fascinating insights about how people with different political views respond to different topics. So, for example, when the president tweeted about Russia, a lot of people that identify themselves as more liberal, that generated a lot of impact, as opposed to the people that identify themselves as more conservative. So we built these tools called classifiers, where we were able to analyze at large scale how people saw themselves within the political spectrum, and then assess how they respond differently to different topics that the president tweets. So that's a very specific example of how we are using machine learning within our newsroom. The second example has to do with generating new versions. So all of us as publishers, we are in different platforms, mobile, web, voice interfaces. And so one thing that AP does is that we spend a lot of time converting print stories, so stories that are meant to be read, into broadcast stories, so stories that are meant to be spoken on air. And that process takes about 800 hours a week for our journalists to do. So what we are doing now, we are in an exploration phase, is whether we can use this new technology, or I should say a subdomain of artificial intelligence, which is called natural language processing, to turn one version of a story, so you see on the left side the full-length article from AP, into a shorter version. And so imagine the applications that this has in terms of creating efficiencies within the newsroom. So now those journalists that are spending a lot of time doing this time-consuming task of creating versions, now they can do other things. They can do multimedia, they can investigate stories, and so on. Again, this is not fully implemented. We are within the experimentation phase. And I think that's one thing that Lisa mentioned, is that our automation and artificial committee, the goal of that group is to essentially assess opportunities and evaluate them against our needs. All right, so that's another example that we are assessing within the language space of artificial intelligence. The other one is the ability to transcribe content in real time. This is a project developed by the Reynolds Journalism Institute, which is this little app that is used by journalists that allows automated transcription of interviews. So imagine you are interviewing your subject, and in real time, the app can actually transcribe the full interview. And again, you can see the impact that this has in terms of creating more efficiencies, generate faster reporting, and free up journalists to do more high-impact journalism. The same technology, which is speech to text, so turning speech, the spoken word, into text, can be deployed to video transcriptions, for example, or subtitles. So another real example that you can start using right away. Then another area of opportunity that the automation committee within the Associated Press is testing is automating some of our processes, specifically when it comes to photo editing. So the example you see here is using computer vision, which again is another relevant subdomain of artificial intelligence, to automatically generate tags for the photos. So in this case, it identifies that there's the color yellow, it's a red carpet, there's a dress, it's related to fashion. The next iteration to this type of technology is the ability to create captions for the photos in real time. So again, the story is always the same. Can we free up resources of doing these time-consuming efforts so our editors and our journalists can focus on other types of journalism?
And just, I thought I'd explain a little further because, you know, one might be asking how a keyword for yellow might be useful to a newsroom. I mean, one of the great things about machine learning is that the machine learns by teaching it. And so, for example, I mean, we do this with text and we can do it with images. You essentially feed the robot volumes and volumes of examples, and it learns how to recognize the language and it learns how to recognize the images. So the test for us, in the case of text, and Francesco showed the example of the longer text story and then the shorter summary next to it. So you feed the robot thousands of examples of long stories and summaries that our journalists have written, and over time, the machine learns what that summary is supposed to look like. And you just do that over and over and over again. And the same thing with images. So for us at AP, the question is, well, can we teach the robot to recognize Donald Trump in a photo, or actually be able to call that Jennifer Lopez? Because if we can teach it to do that, then, you know, we've really assisted our editors and our journalists in captioning, or, you know, not having to write that extra version, or whatever it is. But I just wanted to explain that because, I mean, this right now that you see on the screen is probably the most simplest, you know, the simplest version of that. The goal is to train by feeding it examples and make it more and more sophisticated over time. So, I mean, that's really the definition of what machine learning is.
Absolutely, and that brings up a very important point, which is the role of publishers within artificial intelligence. So most of us don't have the resources that a big technology company has in terms of being able to hire data scientists in very expensive technology. But there's an important thing that we have, which is content and data. And that content, those images, those text stories can be used to train all of these algorithms. So there's a very important position that publishers are in now, which is to team up with technology companies to improve these systems. finally, another subdomain of artificial intelligence that the Associated Press is deploying is robotics. And in this case, what you're seeing is one of the automated cameras that we used at the Rio Olympics in 2016. And we use these cameras to capture photos from unique angles to augment the human capability of capturing a moment from a perspective that is normally not seen. And this is important because artificial intelligence can help with two things. One is volume, so creating a lot of content, but it can also help with differentiation. So creating content that not a lot of people are able to produce. So we went through these 5 different subdomains of artificial intelligence: machine learning, language, speech, and robotics. And these are some of the examples that are relevant. There are many other areas of exploration, and we are continuing to do that exploration through our automation committee. As I mentioned at the beginning, my role is to essentially look big picture and identify trends within the market, and ask ourselves 3 important questions when assessing our AI strategy. Which, by the way, the same way that 10 years ago everyone needed a digital strategy and eventually evolved to being just strategy, the same will happen with AI and automation. You'll require an AI and automation strategy, but 5 years from now, 3 years from now, it will just become common practice within your news organizations. So going back to the 3 questions that you should ask yourself when designing AI strategy for your newsroom is, are you automating or are you augmenting? So the idea of automating is some of the examples that Lisa mentioned, of creating a lot of volume of content and creating, turning data into stories, for example, or augmenting, so enhancing human creativity and capabilities by using these tools to create new forms of reporting, to create new approaches to the story. The second question to ask yourselves is, are you going to focus on content or process? So an example of automating content is generating news reports from data. An example of automating a process is generating tags for a photo, or choosing the best photo using computer vision. And then the third question, which is actually one of the most relevant questions, is, should you build it yourself or should you partner? Right? So these technologies are very expensive, and our approach has been to, in many cases, to collaborate and to partner either with emerging startups, research institutes, and universities. And this third question is important because the AI landscape in terms of startups and research is quickly evolving. This is a graph that is very relevant for content creators like all of us, that maps out all of the different startups that are helping publishers automate text, audio, video, and graphics. This image was created by a company called Gibbs. But just to say that this landscape is quickly evolved. This chart was published last month. I'm sure there are new startups today operating in different areas of text, audio, and video by now. So it's important for journalists and executives working at publishing companies to keep track of all of the evolution of the market and understanding the technology. You don't necessarily need to know how to build a neural network or a machine learning system or anything complex, but you need to know what capabilities can you explore using what's available out there. And so Lisa will guide you through specific considerations that our team in the newsroom navigates through, and we'll start digging into the specifics of deploying automation in artificial intelligence.
I think one of the things that's really important about the term augmentation rather than automation is that very few of these technologies truly remove the journalist from the process because there's so much quality control and testing around them. And those are some of the things that I'm going to get to in my part of the presentation. So let's talk about the risks associated with automated stories or augmented stories. I mean, one of the most common questions I get about our automated stories at AP is, what about errors? What happens when, does the robot make errors? How do you deal with that? So I'll say a couple of things about that. These technologies all rely on data, clean, consistent data. So the ability for a robot to produce a story is only as good as the data it's drawing from. So if you have error-ridden data, you're going to have error-ridden stories. And I'll show a concrete example of that when I get more into earnings, the earnings case study. That's sort of with text. In the case of video, if any of you have worked with automated video technologies, again, the success of that depends on the sophistication of your keywording on your video and your photos, because the algorithm is searching for photos and videos that have keywords that match up with the text story you're feeding it. So if you've improperly keyworded your photo or video, or you haven't sufficiently keyworded your photo or video, then the robot doesn't really know what to pull, and it might pull something that makes no sense. So having that underlying core data is really critical to all of this. But when people ask me specifically about our earnings stories, we've done tests that show that our error rate is actually slightly less than our human journalists for a very simple reason. Robots do not make typos, nor do they make math errors. And so that alone has reduced our error rate sufficiently. The other big issue that is of concern with automated stories has to do with context. We don't pretend that our earnings stories or our sports game recaps have any sort of historical context or will give you a full picture of a company's strategy. They're meant to be very basic snapshots of a particular point in time. So it's a very worthy debate to talk about the value of that and what we're really providing to our audience. But there's no question that the stories that we're producing are pretty simple in nature. And we'll get to that a little bit. Workflow disruption. I think I said before something like, automation isn't free. I mean, reducing the work of my reporters in writing earnings stories was terrific, but it creates other kinds of work, like maintaining the data that I mentioned. I have editors who are spending way more time on maintaining a massive database of publicly traded companies than they did before. I mean, that's just a very simple example of the kind of workflow changes and tasks that have to be done differently when you're incorporating automation into your process. With skills, I mean, we're finding that in order for us to really maximize the use of these technologies, we need to train our journalists in, it's called branch writing. I mean, essentially writing templates, writing for algorithms. It's not rocket science, but it's a skill that needs to be taught. Using these new tools in automated video or whatever it might be, building the tools. These require data coding and development and engineering skills that newsrooms are just really beginning to develop fully. Along those lines, AP hired we have an automation editor, probably one of the first organizations to have somebody with that title. Justin Myers, he is an engineer and a journalist. He has degrees in both, and he now works with us to create projects around automation and help us manage those. And we're working on a training program that's going to train additional staff in how to do these things. So when considering whether to do these sorts of projects, and it gets a little bit back to the build it yourself or partner question, you know, you can have a technology company do everything for you, or you can bring in some of those skills in-house and work on building some of your own and maybe collaborating, or, you know, there's a whole spectrum of things you can do there. But there's no question that it requires different kinds of skills than possibly what newsrooms are used to. So I'll talk a little bit about earnings automation just as a vehicle to walk you through some of the considerations and how we do it. So a lot of people, I want to clear up, robots are not scraping earnings releases for data. That part of it is not automated. I mean, talk about error risk. We don't do that. We partner with an investment research firm to collect the data. They have staff that does that and enter the data into files that essentially ping the robot. The business news staff at AP worked over several months to write the templates for these earnings stories. So if earnings are up, what does the story say? If earnings are way up, what does the story say? We had to write the language for every possible scenario that a corporate earnings story might have. Write a variety of headlines. I mean, all those sorts of things. I mean, when we sit down to write our story, we're writing based on one set of facts. But when writing a template for automation, you're having to imagine all the possible scenarios that might result from the data that you're going to get. So this was a process that we worked on over months, testing, perfecting it, you know, making sure it didn't, you know, spit out garble, you know, I mean, all kinds of considerations on that.
And I would add one thing, which is one of the crucial points of automation is an editorial decision, which is the creation, as Lisa mentioned, of these templates, which requires a new type of skill set, which is branch writing, which is very, very different from the way that journalists traditionally write. So it's more similar to developing code than to actually write the story.
One of the key things that we talked about was how do we, what responsibility do we have and how do we communicate to our audience that this story was not written by a human journalist? And so the decision was made in collaboration with AP's standards editor, the former of which is here in this room right now. That we did have a duty to disclose that the story was generated through automation technology. And so every earnings story has a tagline at the bottom. We believe very strongly in disclosure so that people know where the story came from. Just some more practical, before automation, my human staff, which is approximately 60 reporters and editors, mostly in the US, but some in Europe and Asia, we were writing approximately 300 earnings stories per quarter. And any of you who've ever covered earnings or earnings season know that there's those crazy 2 to 3 weeks every quarter where it feels like you are doing nothing else but sitting there hunched over your computer starting at 6 a.m. when companies start releasing their earnings, writing as fast as you can so you can, you know, get it out on the wire. And so we were doing 300. After automation, we're averaging about 3,700, sometimes more. We automate earnings stories for companies traded on US markets, which includes some international companies, down to a $75 million market cap. We're also doing approximately 600 Canadian companies. Actually, before I get to this slide, I want to say more about the real-world impact in my newsroom of automation. That time that journalists were spending writing earnings stories, now that they don't have to do that anymore, I was able to beef up my technology coverage, my personal finance team. I can draw an absolute direct line from earnings work to projects, creative work, investigative stories that my staff has done as a result of having more time to really cover their beats and use their skills and source building and creativity. So for us, it was a really significant win in terms of being able to upgrade the level of our journalism while still providing the same kind of basic financial information to the audiences and even more so. Francesco mentioned this at his panel yesterday. We just wanted to make the point that it's interesting what suddenly a very high volume of stories can do. Stanford University did a study using data information from our automated earnings stories and found that it has a real-world impact on trading. A lot of these smaller companies never got an earnings story before. Nobody really covered them because most newsrooms don't have the staff or the interest in writing those stories. And the study found that there were actual increases in trading after our earnings stories were published on the wire. So it's something really important to know for us that what we're doing has this real world impact, and it really sobers us up sometimes and make sure all that testing and quality assurance we do is really critical.
Yeah, and very simply what you see in this graph is the impact of automation, where you see after we publish a story on day 0, the increase in volume, and you see the spike there of more companies being traded on based on the information, since people are not now able to learn more about them since we are covering those companies.
So, I mean, just some additional takeaways. We were able to use automation to help us get stories out faster and in a way that's more friendly to their workflow. We needed to come up with processes for how we were going to handle this sudden rush of earnings stories. And as I mentioned before, we spent months testing the system and practicing and all kinds of scenarios before we went live, so to speak. I mean, now our earnings stories go straight to the wire with no editor viewing them. Yeah, and again, I mean, I think the automation strategy committee that we actually have a scoring matrix that we use to evaluate whether we should pursue an automation project. And it involves some of those things that we've been talking about that are basically common sense. Is it going to enable you to produce more stories, videos, versions of stories, whatever, that are going to serve your customers? Is it going to save your staff time by eliminating routine tasks and so they can do more interesting, important things? What are the costs? All those sorts of considerations come into play. One of the big costs, yes, you might have to pay for tools or, pay to partner with a company, but one of the big costs that you have to remember is maintenance, the time spent maintenance, and I was referring to this before. So this right here, I realize it's a slide on a screen, but I'm going to try to. So we maintain Excel spreadsheets for all of our companies that we're automating, and you can see a little bit about what goes into producing the templates. You have to tell the robot what the name of the company is. What do you call the company on second reference? Because you're not going to just keep repeating the long name every time. You have to tell the robot, what do you call it on third reference? Like all those little things you have to tell it. I also want, we have a column here called priority. So during earnings season, as you know, hundreds and hundreds of companies are reporting at the same time, and you have to tell the robot, well, if you've got 300 earnings stories that you're generating, which ones do you send first? So we want to make sure that the robot sends earnings stories about Apple and Walmart and Google first, and not some of these smaller companies that not as many people have heard of. So we assign priority tiers, and all those things tell the robot what order to push out the stories.
And again, that's a decision by a human, so it's an editorial decision within an automated process.
Yeah, and we're constantly evaluating those. So there are companies that nobody has heard of and nobody cares about, and then suddenly they make news. Well, now we've got to change their priority because now people care about them more. So this is a constant, this is what I mean by maintenance. You know, it's a constant process. You're always looking at your data. You're always looking at how things are working. We routinely do reports on, you know, how quickly are we getting the stories to market, you know, all those sorts of things. You'll see here there's a column, and it's Y or N. There are some companies that we actually don't automate. We tell the robot, don't automate. And usually that's because their earnings are just so complicated that the chance of error is so high that it's not worth the risk of putting out an incorrect story. So it's those kinds of decisions that you're obviously making. And for all these poor people on this side of the room, I can show you all later. But anyway, yeah, we're going to take questions, but is that it?
Yeah, so just a few parting thoughts, and then we'll open up for a few questions, and we'll be around if you want to discuss in person. So a few takeaways for you to consider. So technology is always changing. Today's artificial intelligence or virtual reality or blockchain, whatever it might be, journalism doesn't change just because the tools change. And as Lisa mentioned that automation and AI can make errors if the data is not vetted, if it's not controlled by human editors and journalists. AI is not going to solve all of the problems. There's no silver bullet for the disruption going on in the publishing industry. And the best way to really start implementing this is for you to start becoming more fluent in these different technologies by being exposed to different case studies, experimenting, and this doesn't require a lot of investment. And finally, Lisa mentioned that we worked with our former standards editor to go through all the different considerations that go into implementing these AI systems within the newsroom. And as I mentioned, we'll be open up for a few questions, but in the meantime, if you're interested in diving deeper into this subject, you can download our free report on journalism in artificial intelligence, or go to our Twitter handle, and we just publish it there. I think this will give you a more comprehensive view of everything that is possible within automation. And so with that, we conclude the masterclass today. We'll open up for a couple questions. I know we are pressed on time, and if anyone has questions.
Yeah, I have a couple of very quick questions on the. I'm curious to know the extent to which you, when you do automate earnings, you can prioritize figures, so you can determine which earnings figures are put at the top of the report and lower down. And secondly, if you've built in any kind of automation to alert your on, say, a major earnings miss, so that when you have 37,100 to get through, they need some help.
So we have not yet gotten to the point where we are using bots or any kind of technology to alert reporters for any earnings surprise. We're not doing that yet. I mean, just to explain a little bit more about how it works, I don't want to suggest that AP reporters never cover earnings anymore. What this has freed us from is that need to be hunched over, waiting for that earnings release and writing that first 100 words and getting it out quickly. Instead, we take the top 80 to 100 companies, global consumer brands that everybody knows and cares about, and we ask the beat reporters to really think about, you know, watch for news, look for the most important things. We write thematic stories about earnings. You know, what are the most interesting things we can say about the companies right now? So we have not set up a system that alerts. We've talked a lot about that, though, the earnings surprise factor and whether we can build that in a little bit to the technology. Now, you were asking also about the templates. Yes, we can do any of that. We can instruct the algorithm, for example, if earnings grew more than 20%, that's the first thing you put in the story. Yes, you can work with it to tell it all sorts of things. We have chosen deliberately to keep it somewhat simple. We don't want necessarily a gazillion iterations of these stories running around. For consistency's sake, we tend to keep it pretty simple. Earnings did this, revenues did this, it beat expectations, it missed expectations, the stock price did this. And so by doing that, it helps us maintain quality and consistency, which is something AP is known for, and frankly reduces maintenance and error time on the back end if we keep things as consistent as possible.
You showed the example of shortening an article with the natural language recognition. Do you also think about doing different versions for different user groups, young people or simpler language or something like that?
Yeah, so the first thing that we are evaluating is versions for different ways of writing the story, so print versus broadcast. We had a lot of discussions about the whole field of personalization, and that's a tricky question, because if you personalize too much, then you end up creating filter bubbles, right? So if I'm writing for you, you're a young person, you enjoy being spoken with informal language, versus someone else that wants to have a more formal structural language, and you're more interested in company X or versus company Y, then we start giving you the information that only you want, right? And what happens to the diversity of the news agenda? So that's a very tricky question, but that's definitely possible in terms of the technology, changing tone, changing the stance. One thing that I think that is relevant within automation that we have been exploring is for sports stories, you can provide different points of view, right? So if you are let's say it's a Barcelona-Madrid game, you can provide the perspective of Barcelona if you are a fan of that team versus Madrid, and so changing that perspective. But again, there are a lot of ethical considerations that go into deep personalization, because as a journalism organization, the last thing you want to do is to create information bubbles and to create these closed clusters of information.
But primarily, I think we have talked about things like stories for a US audience versus stories for an international audience, because there are simple things about phrasing, that you could very easily build into the robot to correct for that. So not really changing the story as much as some of those stylistic considerations around, President Donald Trump, or U.S. President Donald Trump, that sort of thing. So those are very basic. I think translation fits into our versioning bucket, using automation to, automatically translate. But primarily so far, it's been mostly about taking that 500-word text story and using automation to quickly create the summary, create the short version, create the broadcast version, create the, it's those sorts of things that we've primarily talked about so far. But as Francesco said, certainly customization and personalization is out there as an opportunity.
So we have time for one more question.
Only one?
Can we? Okay, so two more questions, maybe three.
Very, very short one. Will this decrease the number of your employees?
We have not decreased a single employee because of automation. We have used the technology to free up time for them to do other things. So, I think when it comes to messaging this kind of technology to staffs, it's really important to stress that, if that in fact is your goal. I mean, you know, I often say if a newsroom wanted to reduce staff by using automation, it's certainly possible. That's not what we chose to do. We wanted to, our goal was and remains, how do we remove low-value tasks from what our journalists are doing and allow them to be able to concentrate on actually producing the journalism. So that's how we're approaching it.
Thank you. I'm really curious about the rollout of AI across the newsroom. When you expose the people in the business desk to this branch writing, like new techniques, you upskill them. Do they then stay in the business desk and then you train a different team in sports, or do they become evangelists that then can kind of work across verticals to share what they've learned in writing for AI?
Well, so far, I mean, partly I think because we're such a large news agency with scale, I mean, the projects we've done so far have been large. So we've worked very closely with Automated Insights, our partner, to do those. So we really haven't, like, my reporters don't know branch writing yet. We're only at the beginning of realizing what the opportunities are, and we're going to work on that. But I think to your point, that is how we're discussing approaching it, is that we would likely train people in business, people in sports, and then have that spread out across the AP. I mean, when it comes to story automation, we've talked about things like local housing prices, you know, local, I mean, any sorts of data point you could, in theory, automate a story about if you chose. And so it certainly will grow beyond business and sports, and we almost certainly will do that ourselves. But we're in the process of developing that now.
Yeah, and so as part of that effort, we are starting to create training materials that will first deploy within our own newsroom. But then the long-term goal as a co-op is to open up those skills and that knowledge to other news organizations that we work with. All right, so one more question.
Yes, I think the AP case is really interesting. And what bothers me is that why is there such little news automation in newsrooms? I mean, everybody's talking about AP, but besides AP, there's not much else. Is this, what are the reasons for this?
I mean, certainly there are other examples, of course, especially in the world of financial data. I mean, Bloomberg has a large team. We all probably know about the LA QuakeBot. Other organizations are using bots with a lot of frequency. So there's some of that. You know, I mean, think about the adoption of any new technology. You know, I think it's often slow, a little scary. I mean, the jobs question gets at some of the fears around it. It takes coding and engineering expertise that not all newsrooms have. My sense is that the larger organizations are doing it more, and that eventually that'll spread down. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, and I would just add a quick thought on that, which is you need to marry process with experimentation. So as we mentioned, we have sort of a roadmap into how to assess artificial intelligence and deployment of automation within the newsroom. But on the other side, we are investing a lot in terms of creating a culture of innovation where we can do small projects, we can do proofs of concept and collaborate with universities, startups. And surprisingly, that doesn't require a lot of financial resources. So I think there's also psychological barrier of, you know, it's artificial intelligence, it's something very complex. It might cost a lot of money, but in a lot of cases, that's all what we have experienced. So my parting advice for publishers who want to test this is to, number one, have a process in place that aligns with your objectives within the newsroom, but also leave room for experimentation, for error, and for innovation. So we'll have to go now, but we'll stay around here in the AP booth upstairs. So if you have any questions, just feel free to come speak to us. And if you have the chance, go to our website and just take a look at the report we published. So thank you very much.
Thank you.